Welcome in and welcome back. This is a movie review. This is a movie review in correlation with a book review that I posted on Strip Cover Lit. If you are here for this channel but you have no idea what Strip Cover Lit is, it is the channel on YouTube on which I review books, talk about books, poems, short stories, literature in general. I will leave a comment from that channel pinned in the comments below. If you are more interested in that than this, or you are interested in books at all, are you cockeyed? You can follow me over there as well. I think that might be more offset. I should really do this before I press the record button, shouldn't I? Oh well, I have no way of straightening this son of a bitch. But the way I do movie reviews over here, this will be for The Shining, the 1980 Stanley Kubrick film. The way I do movie reviews is I talk about the best scene, I talk about the worst scene, I talk about and the Oscar goes to, which is for the best performance in the movie. I talk a little bit about sort of the literary and thematic themes of the movie, sort of like a lot of people do book reviews, but not a lot of people, I don't think, talk about movies in this way in movie reviews. A lot of video essays on YouTube for this sort of thing, but not necessarily movie reviews in this sort of fashion. But then I go through the literary and thematic terms, like I said, and then maybe some standalone things that I noticed about the movie, and I round things out with a rating and a recommendation based on the movie. So here, for spoiler warning for anyone who has not seen The Shining, we're talking about the 1980 Stanley Kubrick film, which stars, of course, Jack Nicholson as Jack Nicholson. And the best scene in this movie, to me, was the meeting with Grady in the men's room, because it reaches the right amount of creep factor to be had in a movie like this. There's only really one element of this movie which can be written off as completely supernatural, and that is when Grady comes and finds Jack as he is in the cupboard and unlocks the door. But if you really pay attention, at least as far as I can remember, we never see Wendy lock that door. We see her fiddle with things and we see her step back. I don't think we ever see the bolt action going through in that portion of the movie. So all of the supernatural events in this movie might be attributable to people just hallucinating, to this quote-unquote cabin fever, including the very personifications of the ghosts that these people see. Wendy and Danny never see Grady. Grady is unique to Jack. The woman in 237, as far as we know, is unique to Jack. Something happens with Danny in 237, but we never see him interacting with that dichotomized woman, the young naked woman and the older naked woman. We never see him interacting with that individual. The only apparitions which appear to Wendy are in the ballroom that are the skeletons, really, not ghosts at that point. The skeletons of people who have passed, and you see her interacting with a random sort of guy who has his head split. These are the only people we see her interacting with, or interacting with her, in the case of the skeletons, but we never see Jack or Danny interacting with those people, with those apparitions, with those sightings. So it is interesting in that sense. And for me, that is the right level of creep that happens in that men's room scene. It is a very intense conversation where Grady tells Jack, "I've always been here. And so have you." This idea of time not existing in the other world, an idea which we will return to in this review, that idea of the other world. But one thing this scene does better, if you ask me, than the book, is that this scene introduces, and maybe this happens in the book and I just don't remember it. There are, I think, 640 pages or something in the book, so it's very easy. Hold on. 659 pages in the book. There are 659 pages in the book, so something like this would be very easy to forget in the course of 659 pages. But I don't remember this idea of the boy needing to be corrected introduced as thoroughly as it is in this scene. And in the book, we have the idea of taking your medicine. And that idea sort of, now obviously it's a common phrase, but much in the same way that the idea of Wendy and Jack calling Danny Doc is, I don't believe, ever introduced in the movie until the fact that O'Halloran says it, and then Wendy says, hey, we call him Doc, how did you know? The phrase, take your medicine, is never introduced, I don't think, really in the book as anything appreciable. And in this movie, that phrase of the boy needing to be corrected is introduced. He needs to be corrected. Which is a small thing to introduce, but it is something that makes an idea more comfortable in the mind. And comfortable in the mind is an element that is necessary in the horror genre. Being comfortable with an idea makes it accessible, makes it predictable without making it, makes it necessary without making it predictable, if that makes any sense. It is something that has to be echoed, and we understand that it will be echoed, but it doesn't come off as predictable. We don't know where it's going to be echoed, if that makes any sense. Also, this scene is a cool 6 minutes long. A cool 6 minutes of dialogue. That's something you don't see today. You don't see in today's movies. Not in any great number. Anytime you see something like this in today's world, there will be any number of bloggers and vloggers and YouTube critics who say, oh my God, that scene halfway through the movie that was like 19 minutes of dialogue. That's movie making. That scene doesn't seem so long because it fits into the movie. And it has to fit into the movie. And the way that it fits into the movie is the fact that Stanley Kubrick is not sitting back on his laurels and saying, let's throw some fucking ghosts in there. Let's see how that works out. Let's just throw all sorts of paranormal stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Maybe they'll jump. That is not the type of scare upon which this movie is built, and it is a movie that has lasted 40 years now. But the worst scene in the movie is that scene where Wendy is traipsing around the hotel. She's traipsing around the hotel looking like Chandler Bing. But she's traipsing around the hotel, and it bookends the furry blowjob scene where she's traipsing around with that knife like a goddamn Muppet. It looks so put on in a movie that is pretty good about not looking put on. And the Oscar goes to, for this movie, obviously Jack Nicholson. Anytime a person manages to put themselves into the pantheon of horror film baddies without an ounce of makeup on your face, without a single coating of plastic about your face, with no prosthetics, without much blood, Jack Nicholson put himself in the pantheon of horror film baddies by smiling a whole lot and saying things in a very creepy manner. But the best acting in this movie, the most natural feeling character in this movie, the only character to my estimation that has not a single moment on camera that doesn't feel stilted. A lot of the acting in this movie at times feels sort of stilted. Not put on, but stilted. Where you are aware that the actor is aware of where the camera is in sort of a George Lucas type directing fashion. The only actor that does not have a single... Ullman was awful, but the only actor that does not have a single moment like that is Scatman Crothers, who plays O'Halloran. Feels very natural in that character. That was a great performance, and it's a performance you want to see him. You want to see O'Halloran. You miss O'Halloran when O'Halloran is gone. And Because of that, we want to see him come back and save the family. And we are sad, spoilers again, we are sad when he dies. Both of those things are pretty necessary for this movie really to work. Now, this movie works as a movie, and it works as a movie independent from the text, from the book written by Stephen King, The Shining. But it's very, very interesting that it does, because, well, you know what, maybe there is some question as to whether or not it does, but I don't think there's question as to whether or not it does, because it has, like I say, lived for 40 years now. The movie's legendary. The book is legendary. I have never seen the movie without having read the book. I read the book before I saw the movie for the very first time. So maybe it is unfair for me to assume that this movie works without the book having been read, but it is interesting that the movie does work independent of the book, despite the fact that a lot of fascia, the connective tissue, simply does not exist in the movie. A lot of the scene where O'Halloran connects with Danny, we have a whole lot more of that story in the book. We have a lot more of Jack's descent into madness in the book. We have very little here. In fact, one of the most abrasive differences between the book and the movie is in the book, Jack's really sort of a sympathetic character. But in the movie, as it is Jack Nicholson playing the role of Jack Nicholson, he's never likable. You just can't look away from him, because the moment Jack Nicholson is on screen, the moment Jack Nicholson is on screen, you figure if you look away from him, he'll stab you, no matter what movie it is. So it is interesting that this, at least presumably, if I am not taking this too far, does work, despite the fact that it differs so heavily from the book. One of the things that is unique to the movie, apart from the book, obviously is Jack Nicholson and Jack Nicholson's performance. But there's a small scene, be easy to miss, be easy not to remember, where they are very first in the hotel and Wendy brings Jack breakfast. And one of the first things Jack does after Wendy wakes him up and says, "Hey, it's 11 o'clock, it's 11:30, what are you doing?" He's surprised it's 11:30, and he checks his tongue in the mirror. It's a very strange thing, but it's kind of unique to the movie because we see Jack Nicholson's tongue a lot. But why would he be checking his tongue? Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the moment he checks his tongue in the mirror, it looks bright red. One of the signs of a B12 deficiency is a bright red tongue. It's one of the only reasons for a doctor to check your tongue. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a licensed physician, so don't take my word for that. Maybe there are tons of reasons and I just don't know them. I haven't been to the doctor since I was 17. One of the only reasons that I know of for a doctor to check your tongue. What are the effects of a B12 deficiency? Many people report feelings of depression when they are B12 deficient, and they are also seemingly hyper irritable. Maybe these are things at play with the character of Jack Torrance. But in one of the clunkier sort of transitions that I'm going to get into in this review, but it does come back to this, I promise, we can recognize Danny in this movie as the protagonist. One of the ways that protagonists are often able to be pinpointed in a movie is that the protagonist will learn something earlier in the film and come back and use that knowledge to win the day later in the film. Remember, for example, in Iron Man, when he takes his test flight way up into the atmosphere and ices up. Whoops, malfunctions everything, ruins stuff, and he comes crashing back to Earth. Later in the movie, spoilers, when Iron Man is at battle with the, what is it, Ironmonger, I think is the character's correct name, the Ironmonger, he runs away from him by flying straight up. And then he asks him as he's being chased, how did you solve the icing problem? And the ironmonger says, the icing problem? You might want to get on that, right? That is a protagonist's move. Oftentimes, the good guy in comic books is not necessarily stronger, but is smarter. This is one of the ways that we know good guys from bad guys. Earlier in the film, Danny goes through the maze with his mother. He does this right on the tail end. Right on the tail end of a scene where Jack says, yeah, we'll go for a walk later. I got to get my work in first. How about I do my writing first, hon? From that scene, we cut to Wendy and Danny running through the grounds and going to the maze. He learns that maze, and later in the movie, he traps his father in that maze, the Minotaur. He traps the Minotaur in that maze. And the funny thing about this, the first thing, while we're sort of still on the idea of the book differing from the movie, and why is that? Where are those differences and why can we use them? The book ends in fire. The movie ends in ice. But as Jack is chasing Danny through that maze, he loses his tongue. He starts ambling and shouting like an animal. He's not saying Danny. He's making noises that we assume he means Danny. He is making random noises as he loses his tongue. Why is that super necessary to understanding maybe this movie? Jack's tongue is his livelihood. Jack is a writer. Tongues are words. Jack's words are his livelihood, at least the livelihood that he is hoping to have. And he loses them as he is chasing his son like a wild animal through that maze, like a minotaur. Which leads us to the reason that Jack turns against Wendy. The only verbalized reason that Jack turns against Wendy, the only thing he uses his words and tells us, is that he's turning against Wendy. He's telling Wendy he's turning against her because she doesn't understand that he signed a contract to take care of the Overlook Hotel. Don't you understand that? This is an idea which is played up much more in the book. But in the book, Jack is doing all of the work in the hotel. Wendy is more or less homekeeping. Jack is the one, he's on the roof, boarding up the windows. He's dealing with the boiler where he's heating and cooling the right portions of the hotel. He's doing all of that stuff. We don't see him doing that in the movie. So what is Jack's work? Jack's work is writing. And maybe the most telling bit of the writerhood of Jack that we get is we are introduced to his desk, to his office, to his workroom. His workroom is just the downstairs. It's the entire downstairs, apparently, as he gets mad at Wendy for approaching him when he's in his office, when he's at work. But he works in an entire floor of the hotel. And the desk that he chooses to work at, where is it? What is it looking at? He's looking at a flight of stairs that has 3 entrances and 1 exit. 1 exit at the 2nd story. But there's 3 ways to get there. From the left, from the right, from the center. But you have to end up on that 2nd story. But you're walking up. You're looking upwards. You're staring into something greater. What's behind that desk? Later in the movie, as Jack is going crazy, behind that desk is a great big void. Is that Jack's subconscious? We see as Wendy is reading All Work and No Play Makes Jack a Dull Boy over and over and over again. Jack has been watching her from deep within his subconscious, that dark, dark space. And then he approaches. So we are coming from the deep recesses of the mind and hoping to get somewhere. Don't screen cap that. That was bad. And hoping to work our way up into something more idyllic, something better. Hoping to work our way up into something else, into a better life. And there are 3 sets of stairs. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Father, Son, and Holy Shit. Jack, Wendy, Danny. These are the ways to get to a better life. These are the ways to pursue a better life. Now, as I said a little bit earlier, much of the book focuses on Jack's work in the hotel. Focuses on what it means to look after the Overlook Hotel when the Overlook Hotel is shut down. It is with this lifestyle that Jack falls in love. It is with this lifestyle that Jack loses, it is to this lifestyle that Jack loses control and ends up becoming a part of the Overlook Hotel. Gets talked into by Grady et al. Into becoming one with that hotel. In the movie, the only person we see doing any of the work in the hotel is Wendy. The only work that we see Jack doing is his writing. In this way, therefore, Jack embodies in the film the artist and nothing else. His only work, his only real work, the reason he moved his entire family to the Overlook Hotel is not to be in the Overlook's employ. It is to be a writer. It is to be the artiste. He loses himself to that idea, to that ideal, and ends up becoming one with the hotel, not despite that, but because of it. Why might I say because of it? Look at the mirrors. There's something funny going on with the mirrors in this film. So remember that scene where Jack checks his tongue in the mirror? We see Jack first in the mirror. We see Wendy approaching Jack, but the Jack that we see is not the real Jack. It's the Jack as reflected in a mirror. Jack is actually, we pan, I think, to see Jack on the bed in real life, and he checks his tongue in that mirror to see what's going on there. He trusts that mirror more than he trusts his wife. After the scene in room 237, Wendy opens the door, and so Jack knocks on the door to their apartment, to their home, their little house there, the apartment which is theirs in the Overlook Hotel. Jack knocks on the door. Wendy approaches, and as she opens the door, and this is a cool camera trick done with angles and lighting in a way that I have never seen, and I was shocked to see it. I never noticed this before. As she opens the door, we see Jack's reflection in a mirror in the hallway before we see Jack outside the door. Very, very cool effect. I don't know how they did it, especially because the mirror in which we see Jack first does not appear to be off the wall. I wonder if they had to make a ramp for that mirror so that it is angled without looking angled. But we see Jack in the mirror first. And then he comes in and he's lying to Wendy saying, no, there's nothing up there. There's nothing up there. Is this the fake Jack? This is the Jack that has been enveloped by the Overlook Hotel. That we see first, that we get first, that comes into the room, adding to that. Remember that scene with Grady that was 6 minutes long and a whole bunch of creepy dialogue, yada, yada, yada. Immediately after that scene, we cut to Wendy in their little abode, and she's pacing back and forth. She's pacing back and forth. Remember that scene? She's pacing back and forth in front of a mirror. But we never see her reflection in that mirror. Wendy does not exist in the mirror. Jack does. Jack exists in the other world being the fake world inside the real world of the Overlook Hotel. He has been consumed by the Overlook Hotel and exists within the other world, the creepy other world. So what are we to make of that? What is going on there? I think one of the things that is necessary to also notice in this film is books. When we meet Wendy and we meet Danny, they're in their old home. They're in the place they actually live. There are in that home books and books everywhere. When we first meet Wendy, she is reading a book. She's reading Catcher in the Rye. I don't know what to do with that quite, but I'm sure there's something to be made there. Pardon me. That would not have been a coincidence. That would not have been a coincidental observation. It would have been something that Kubrick would have made the decision on and gone with. I don't know why. Having read Catcher in the Rye, I'm not sure what to make of that. Maybe you can tell me in the comments section if you have any idea why that would have been. But in addition to that, there are books stacked next to the TV. You've got the TV stand, you've got books stacked next to the TV, a couple books on top of the TV, a couple books on the other side, then there's the shelves below the TV which have books on them as well. You have books all over Danny's room. They're all over the living room, and they're in the windowsills. We get this shot of Wendy as she is facing out to the doctor with the kitchen behind her. There's a three-tier bookshelf on the kitchen wall. There's books everywhere. But what books do we see Jack interacting with? We don't. The only books that Jack seems to have and interact with, there seems to be two very large reference books on his desk. Presumably one would be a dictionary, presumably one would be an encyclopedia. Now you have to remember, this is 1980, this is pre-internet. Dictionaries used to be a thing, guys. Dictionaries used to be a real thing, not just paperweights. So the only books that Jack seems to interact with are reference books, books about reality, not fiction books. Remember, Wendy was reading fiction. We are left to assume Jack writes fiction. So perhaps in this movie, and this is the main thrust here, I think, in this movie, creativity itself is the spooky world. It is the haunting. Creativity itself is the shining. Creativity is the it in which Jack gets lost. He is not... In the book, we have some idea that maybe Jack shines and was never quite privy to that information. In the movie, we have no real reason to believe that he has the shine, but he is in the other world. So it is a strange dichotomy indeed that it would work that way, but it seems to me that this is what is happening there. Jack embodies creativity. Jack embodies the artist that is his work, and his work is how he ends up being belonging to the Overlook Hotel. So I think perhaps in this way, is Jack sort of a portrait of the artist as a young man for Stanley Kubrick? Is Jack a self-portrait of Stanley Kubrick? Stanley Kubrick being obviously a brilliant movie maker, obviously a very creative person, but someone who was oftentimes... So there are stories about Shelley Duvall and what she went through on this set that are not unique to Shelley Duvall and not unique to this movie, but are fairly unique to movies by Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick is someone who was and still is mythological for his abilities and his mental capacity, and often maybe misunderstood, but maybe precisely understood, and a bit of a tyrant. So that is the main thrust of the review, as it will be, but I have some other things to talk about that are differences between the movie and the book that are at least interesting to play with, at least interesting observations, things to go with, things to talk about. pay attention to Danny and his relationship to Jack. Danny is avoidant of Jack. In the book, Jack is abusive, but it is he also loves his son, and his son also loves him, and these things are obvious in the characterization of Jack and Danny as they exist in the book. Not so obvious as they exist in the movie. Jack is a bit of a Jack's Jack Nicholson the moment he walks on screen, right? Not a guy you really want to get to know. The relationship that Jack and Danny have in the book, though it is abusive, they are very closely bonded to one another. There is a lot of love there. And that is something that is difficult to understand oftentimes. But it's a real world thing. The relationship that Jack and Danny seem to have in the movie is a relationship not of abuse and love, but a relationship of abuse and neglect. This is sort of, if you look at the way with which Danny interacts with Jack, if you look at the way those two bounce off of each other, Danny, when he is on screen with Jack, often sort of shies away from him. There's that scene where Danny asks to go get his fire truck, and Jack is awake. Wendy keeps telling him, no, you can't go do that. You're going to wake your dad up. But it turns out Jack's just awake, staring out the window anyhow. And when Danny walks in, he is summoned by Jack. Come here, boy. He doesn't want to. Now, in the book, Danny would have run straight to Jack at that point. He had not, to that point, been very abusive in the hotel. There is also the scene where O'Halloran is first meeting Danny and Wendy and Jack, and Danny gravitates towards O'Halloran and away from Jack. So this sort of shows a different relationship between Jack and Danny than we get in the book. Another thing, this is just a strange little observation. I have said many times that Jack Nicholson playing Jack Torrance is Jack Nicholson playing Jack Nicholson, but Jack is playing Jack. Danny Torrance is played by an actor, the little boy in the movie. Do you know what his name is? Danny Lloyd. So Jack is playing Jack and Danny is playing Danny. So that is a weird little thing. But the last thing that I have to mention before we get into a rating and recommendation based on the text, the choice of alcohols. In the book, Jack was a ginny. He was a drunk with gin. That was his choice in the hotel. Remember the smell of juniper berries. That was a strange choice to me as it first hit me, but upon further review, gin is a drink that has sort of a dichotomy. There are a lot of gin drinkers who are very high class, right? That's how it normally hits me. People who drink gin are hoity-toity sorts, but not always. Bottom shelf gins are extremely inexpensive, and the type of thing that an alcoholic like Jack in the novels may have fallen in love with. Being bottom shelf, being cheap, they're very strong, and they're not in very high demand. Having worked in some of the retail locations that I've worked in, I know that gin is one of the most popular liquors to be stolen. In the movie, he is a bourbon head. He is someone who likes the whiskey. This is very working class. It's just sort of the vibe that whiskey gives off. So I think that there is something at play there as well. This is perhaps a bit of judgment being passed off by Stanley Kubrick. The type of guy that Jack is, he would not have been a gin head. So, rating and recommendation. I would give this movie 80 furry BJs out of 100. It is a movie that I think is pretty good, but I've never loved this movie. I've seen this movie maybe 4 or 5 times now. I enjoyed it more this time than I normally do, having watched it so close in succession to having read the book. But I could leave it or take it. Now, what would I recommend based on this? I would, and this might seem very strange, I would recommend Birdman, starring Michael Keaton by Alejandro Gonzalez Iñárritu, because very much of this movie seems to me to be about art versus life and what is or what is not real. I think that if you were to compare these two texts of The Shining, the film, versus Birdman, you would have not dissimilar readings on the role that art plays on the artist and the effect that it takes. Plus, when you're talking about Michael Keaton versus Jack Nicholson, what's going on there, huh? A couple guys you could compare very easily their on-screen presence. But that is all that I have for this movie review. And don't forget, if you are reading or have read the book, over on Strip Cover Lit, to which I will leave a pinned comment in the comments section, there is an entire 15-part, 16-part, 15-part, I think, read-along for the book by Stephen King. And I hope to see you over there as well.